Welcome, dear traveler, to a journey through time and legend, back to an age when heroes walked the earth and their deeds echoed across the centuries like thunder rolling over distant mountains. Tonight, as you settle into comfort and prepare for rest, I invite you to journey with me to the lands of the North, where the Vikings carved their names into history through courage, honor, and an indomitable spirit that refused to bow before any challenge. These are not tales of darkness and fear, but stories of light and courage, of men and women who faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, not always in the ways they expected, but always with their honor intact. These are the stories that Viking parents told their children to inspire them, that warriors told each other to strengthen their resolve, that the elderly told the young to pass on the values that made their culture great. The Vikings understood something profound about heroism. They knew that true courage was not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. They knew that honor was not about never falling but about rising every time you fell. They knew that a person's true wealth was not measured in gold or land but in reputation, in the stories that would be told about them after they were gone. Tonight, as you listen to these tales of heroic Vikings, let them inspire you, but also let them soothe you. There is something deeply comforting about stories of courage and triumph, about people who faced their challenges with dignity and strength. These stories remind us that humans are capable of greatness, that we can overcome obstacles, that we have within us reserves of strength we may not know about until we need them. Imagine yourself in a great hall, the kind the Vikings built to shelter their communities. The walls are strong and thick, keeping out the cold wind. A fire burns in the center, casting dancing shadows and filling the space with warmth. Around you, the members of the household are settling in for the night, children being tucked into bed, warriors cleaning their weapons one last time before sleep, women finishing their evening tasks. And at the center, near the fire, sits the skald, the storyteller, ready to share tales of the heroes who came before. You are safe here. You are among friends and kin. The doors are barred against the night, and inside all is warmth and peace. The skald's voice rises, strong and clear, and the stories begin. These are stories of your ancestors, real or spiritual, people who lived and loved and fought and died, but who did all of it with such courage and style that their names have survived 1,000 years. Let yourself relax into the listening. There is no test at the end, no requirement to remember every detail. These stories will work on you whether you pay close attention or let them wash over you like waves on a shore. They will speak to something deep in your psyche, something that responds to tales of heroism and honor, something that finds comfort in knowing that humans have always faced challenges and often overcome them. As we begin this journey through the lives of heroic Vikings, let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel your body becoming heavy, sinking into comfort. Feel your mind beginning to quiet, releasing the concerns of the day. The heroes will do the work tonight. They will inspire and protect and comfort. Your only task is to listen, to rest, and to allow yourself to drift gently into the peaceful sleep you deserve. The hall is warm. The fire crackles softly. The storyteller's voice is steady and soothing. And the first tale begins. Of all the Viking heroes whose names have come down to us through the mists of time, few are as famous or as fascinating as Ragnar Lothbrok, sometimes called Ragnar Hairbreeches, a name that came from a peculiar but telling incident in his youth. Ragnar was not just a warrior or a king, but a man of intelligence, strategy, and vision who changed the course of Viking history and whose sons would become legends in their own right. Ragnar was born in Denmark in the early 9th century. The son of a king, but nobility of birth meant little in Viking culture compared to nobility of deed. A man was measured by his actions, his courage, his cleverness, and his honor. Young Ragnar understood this from his earliest days, and he set out to make a name that would outlive his body, a reputation that would echo through the ages. The story of how Ragnar got his famous nickname tells us much about his character. There was a Swedish princess named Thora, known for her beauty and grace, whose father kept her in a small house guarded by an enormous serpent or dragon, depending on which version of the tale you hear. This creature had been given to Thora as a small serpent, but it had grown to monstrous size, and now it coiled around her dwelling, allowing no one to approach. Many warriors had tried to win Thora's hand by slaying the beast, but all had failed and most had died. Young Ragnar, hearing of this challenge, decided to try his luck. But he didn't simply charge in with swords swinging like the heroes before him. Ragnar understood that the serpent's scales were thick and impenetrable to normal weapons, and that its venom could kill a man from a distance. So he used his intelligence. He had a pair of trousers made from animal hides, which he then boiled in tar until they were stiff and tough. He wore these strange trousers along with a heavy cloak, also treated with tar, creating armor that the serpent's venom could not penetrate. Thus protected, Ragnar approached the serpent's lair. The beast, seeing another challenger, reared up and sprayed its venom, but the tar-hardened clothes protected Ragnar. He was able to get close enough to strike, and with his sword and spear, he slew the monster. The people watching gave him the name Lothbrok, meaning hair breeches, in honor of the strange protective garments he had worn. And he won the hand of Thora, the beautiful princess. This story illustrates the essence of Ragnar's character. He was brave, certainly, willing to face a monster that had killed many men before him. But he was also intelligent, using strategy and preparation rather than relying solely on strength. The Vikings admired this combination of courage and cleverness. They knew that the warrior who used his head as well as his sword was the one who survived longest and achieved the most. Ragnar and Thora were happy together, and they had 2 sons, though both died young in circumstances that brought Ragnar great grief. When Thora herself died, Ragnar was devastated. He threw himself into warfare, leading raids across the known world, from the British Isles to the Mediterranean, always seeking glory and gold but perhaps also seeking to fill the void left by his lost love. It was during this period that Ragnar performed some of his most famous exploits. He led raids into Francia, sailing up the Seine River to threaten Paris itself. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, paid Ragnar an enormous tribute of silver to leave the city unharmed. This was the first of many times that European kingdoms would pay the Vikings to go away, a practice that became known as Danegeld. Ragnar understood that sometimes the greatest victory came without a battle, that gold freely given was as good as gold taken by force, and that living to fight another day was better than dying gloriously in a losing cause. But Ragnar was not just a raider and warrior. He remarried, this time to a woman named Aslaug, who was herself of legendary lineage, said to be the daughter of the hero Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhilda. Aslaug gave Ragnar several more sons, and these boys would grow up to become some of the most famous Vikings in history: Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Hvitserk, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ubba. Each would make his own mark on the world, leading the great heathen army that would conquer much of England and establish lasting Viking kingdoms there. As Ragnar grew older, his fame spread throughout the Viking world and beyond. He was known as a man of wisdom as well as courage, someone who could be consulted for advice on matters of law and justice. The Vikings had a complex legal system, and men like Ragnar, who had proven themselves in battle and in peace, were respected as lawgivers and judges. Ragnar understood that a society needed more than just warriors, it needed wise men who could settle disputes and maintain order. But Ragnar's greatest fame, and the story for which he is best remembered, came at the very end of his life. Always restless, always seeking new challenges, Ragnar decided in his old age to raid England one last time. Despite warnings from his advisors and his family, despite his own advancing years, Ragnar gathered a small fleet and sailed across the North Sea. The raid went badly from the start. Storms scattered his ships, and Ragnar's own vessel was driven onto the coast of Northumbria, where it wrecked. Ragnar and his surviving men were captured by King Egil, who had no love for Vikings and even less for the famous Ragnar Lothbrok, whose earlier raids had caused much suffering in English lands. King Egil decided to execute Ragnar in a manner meant to be both painful and humiliating. He had a pit dug and filled with venomous snakes, and into this pit Ragnar was thrown. As the snakes began to bite him, as the venom began to course through his body, Ragnar could have wept or begged for mercy or cursed his fate. But he did none of these things. Instead, he sang. Ragnar composed and sang a death song, a poem recounting his life, his victories, his loves, his sons. Even as he died, he was creating art, ensuring that his story would be remembered. The death song of Ragnar Lothbrok was written down and has survived to this day, a testament to his courage in the face of death and his determination to control his own narrative until the very end. In his death song, Ragnar did not boast of his strength or his killings, though he had plenty of both to boast about. Instead, he spoke of his life as a whole, the joys and sorrows, the victories and defeats. He spoke of his sons with pride, predicting that they would avenge him, which they did. He spoke of his certainty that he would soon be in Valhalla, feasting with the heroes who had gone before. And at the very end, his last words were, "How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers." The little pigs were his sons, and Ragnar knew that when they learned of his death, they would bring down a terrible vengeance on King Egil and all of England. And so they did. When Ragnar's sons learned of their father's death, they gathered the largest Viking army that had ever been assembled and invaded England. King Egil was captured, and according to legend, the sons of Ragnar executed him using the blood eagle, one of the most brutal execution methods known to the Vikings. Whether this actually happened or is merely a legend doesn't matter as much as what it represents, the sons honoring their father by avenging him, as Viking culture demanded. Ragnar Lothbrok's story teaches us many things. It teaches us that intelligence is as important as strength, that preparation and strategy can overcome obstacles that brute force cannot. It teaches us that love and family matter, that a person's legacy lives on through their children. It teaches us that how we face death is as important as how we live, that dignity and courage in our final moments can inspire others for generations. Most importantly, perhaps, Ragnar's story teaches us that a life well lived creates its own immortality. Ragnar has been dead for over 1,000 years, but his name is still known, his stories are still told. He achieved what every Viking hoped for, a reputation that would outlast his body, a name that would be remembered in story and song. As you rest here tonight, let Ragnar's courage inspire you. You may not be fighting dragons or raiding distant shores, but you face your own challenges, your own battles. Face them with intelligence and courage, with the understanding that how you meet your challenges matters as much as whether you overcome them. And know that even when you rest, even when you sleep, you are gathering strength for tomorrow's challenges, just as Ragnar gathered his strength between battles. Let your breath deepen. Let your body relax. Ragnar's story is told, and now you can rest under the protection of his legendary courage. Sleep well, brave listener, and may you face your own challenges with even a fraction of Ragnar's intelligence, courage, and honor. In the Viking world, there was no contradiction between being a fierce warrior and being a sensitive poet, between having the strength to kill your enemies and the gentleness to compose beautiful verse. No one embodied this duality better than Egil Skallagrimsson, one of the most complex and fascinating figures in Viking history, a man who was both terrifying in his rage and moving in his poetry. Egil was born in Iceland around the year 910, the son of Skallagrim Kveldulfsson, himself a famous warrior. From his earliest childhood, Egil showed signs of the fierce temperament that would mark his entire life. Stories tell of how, at age 7, in a fit of rage during a ball game, young Egil grabbed an axe and killed another boy who had been winning against him. This was not considered admirable, even in Viking culture, and Egil's family had to pay compensation, but it showed the intensity of emotion that would characterize Egil's entire life. But Egil was not just a berserker or a killer. He was also, from his earliest years, a poet of remarkable skill. By age 3, he was already composing simple verses, and by his teens, he was creating poetry of such quality that it was remembered and written down decades later. For Egil, poetry was not a hobby or an occasional amusement but a fundamental way of understanding and expressing his experience of life. In Viking culture, poetry was not seen as we often see it today, as something separate from real life, as entertainment or decoration. Poetry was power. The right words, spoken with skill and force, could preserve a person's reputation for generations or destroy it utterly. A good poem could turn public opinion, could settle disputes, could even save a person's life. And Egil Skallagrimsson understood this power better than almost anyone. One of the most famous incidents in Egil's life demonstrates both his poetic skill and his quick thinking. Egil had made many enemies through his life of raiding and feuding, and one of his worst enemies was King Erik Bloodaxe of Norway. The two men hated each other with a passion, and Egil had sworn never to set foot in Norway while Erik ruled there. But fate has a way of making fools of our oaths. Egil was shipwrecked on the coast of Norway and found himself in Erik's territory with no way to escape. He knew that if the king discovered his presence, he would be executed immediately. Egil's friends advised him to flee, to hide, to do anything except what Egil decided to do. He went directly to the king's hall and threw himself on the king's mercy. This sounds like madness, and perhaps it was, but Egil had a plan. He knew that Eirik would want to kill him, but he also knew that Viking customs required a king to hear out a person who came seeking hospitality. Egil had one night to change the king's mind, to convince a man who hated him to spare his life. And he did it with poetry. Through the entire night, Egil composed a poem, a long and complex work in praise of King Eirik. This was no easy task. The poem had to be technically perfect, with the complex meter and alliteration that Viking formal poetry required. It had to be sincere enough to be believable, even though everyone knew that Egil despised the king. And it had to be good enough to impress a man who had heard poetry from the best schools in the land. In the morning, Egil recited his poem, which has come down to us as Hofjellausen, the head ransom. It was a masterpiece, praising Eirik's courage in battle, his generosity to his followers, his wisdom in ruling. The poem followed all the complex rules of court poetry, demonstrating Egil's technical mastery. And somehow, despite being composed under pressure by a man fighting for his life, it was also genuinely moving and beautiful. When Egil finished reciting, the hall was silent. Then King Eirik spoke. "That was a good poem, Egil," he said. "It has bought your life. You may leave in peace." Egil had literally saved his head with poetry, had turned words into a weapon powerful enough to stay the executioner's axe. But Egil's poetry was not all clever strategy and life-saving tricks. Some of his most moving poems were expressions of genuine grief and loss. When Egil's sons died, one drowned at sea and the other killed in an accident, Egil was devastated. He locked himself in his room, refusing food and drink, intending to starve himself to death in his grief. His daughter, Thorgerd, came to him and spoke with him through the door. She couldn't convince him to eat, but she did convince him to do one thing: compose a memorial poem for his dead sons before he died himself. If he was going to die anyway, she argued, at least he could leave something behind, a poem that would honor the boys and preserve their memory. Egil agreed, and he began to compose. The poem he created, Sonatrek, The Loss of Sons, is considered one of the greatest poems in the Old Norse language. In it, Egil poured out his grief, his anger at the gods who had taken his children, his sense of the meaninglessness of living after such loss. The poem is raw and honest, showing a depth of emotion that contradicts the stereotype of Vikings as emotionless warriors. But as Egil composed the poem, something happened. The act of putting his grief into words, of shaping his pain into art, began to heal him. He didn't stop grieving, but he found a way to bear the grief, to live with it. By the end of the poem, Egil has decided to continue living, to honor his sons by remembering them rather than dying with them. Poetry had saved his life again, not from an enemy's sword this time but from his own despair. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of Egil's life, that expression, that putting our feelings into words or art, can help us survive what seems unsurvivable. The Vikings understood this intuitively. They were a people who lived with death constantly, who lost children and spouses and friends to disease, accidents, and violence with heartbreaking regularity. They needed ways to process this grief, and poetry was one of their most important tools. Egil lived to a great age, dying when he was more than 80 years old, ancient for a Viking. His later years were not peaceful. He was querulous and difficult, half-blind and increasingly deaf, causing trouble for his family and neighbors. But even in his old age, he composed poetry, including bitter verses about the indignities of aging and the loss of his former strength. There's a story that in his final years, Egil had several chests full of silver that he wanted to hide so that no one would inherit it after his death. He was carried on horseback to a remote location, where he buried the treasure so well that its location has never been discovered. This final act seems petty and spiteful, hardly the action of a hero. But it's also very human, very real. Egil was not a perfect man, not a cardboard saint or a one-dimensional hero. He was complex, contradictory, sometimes admirable and sometimes detestable, always intensely alive. The legacy of Egil Skallagrimsson is dual. He is remembered as one of the fiercest warriors of his age, a man who killed his first victim at age 7 and continued fighting into his old age. But he is remembered equally as one of the greatest poets in the Norse language, a man who could express depths of emotion that many people feel but few can articulate. He showed that these two aspects, the warrior and the poet, the fierce and the gentle, could coexist in one person. For us listening tonight, Egil's story offers several comforts. It reminds us that expressing our emotions, whether through poetry or any other art form, is not weakness but strength. It reminds us that we are complex beings, containing contradictions, and that this is not a problem to be solved but a reality to be accepted. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when grief seems overwhelming, the act of expression, of shaping our pain into something meaningful, can help us survive and even eventually heal. As you rest here now, think of Egil composing poetry through the night, finding the words that would save his life. Think of him expressing his grief in verse, finding in poetry a way to bear the unbearable. You too have the power of expression, the ability to name your feelings and by naming them, gain some measure of control over them. But tonight, you don't need to compose poetry or write or create anything. Tonight, you simply need to rest, to let your mind and body recover. The creative work can wait for tomorrow. Now is the time for sleep. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind quiet. Egil's fierce courage and his gentle poetry both watch over you tonight, protecting your rest. Sleep now, and may you wake with some of Egil's creative power, some of his ability to express what is within you. But for now, rest. Simply rest. The Vikings are often remembered as a culture of male warriors, but the historical record tells a different story. Women in Viking society had rights and freedoms that were remarkable for their time, and some women chose to take up arms and fight alongside the men. These shield maidens, as they were called, were respected and feared, and their stories have come down to us as examples of courage that transcends gender. Perhaps no shield maiden is more famous than Freydis Eiríksdóttir, daughter of Erik the Red, who showed in a single act of defiance what Viking courage truly meant. Freydis was born into one of the most famous families in Viking history. Her father, Erik the Red, had been exiled from Iceland for killing a man and had sailed west to found the first Norse settlement in Greenland. Her half-brother was Leif Erikson, who would become the first European to set foot in North America, in the land the Vikings called Vinland. Freydis grew up hearing stories of exploration and adventure, of sailing beyond the edge of the known world to find new lands. When she was grown, Freydis decided to follow in her family's footsteps. She organized an expedition to Vinland, the land of vines, where her brother Leif had established a temporary settlement years before. She gathered a crew, arranged for supplies, and set sail across the dangerous North Atlantic. This alone required tremendous courage and organizational skill. The journey to Vinland was long and perilous, with storms and icebergs and the constant possibility of being lost at sea. Freydis and her expedition reached Vinland and began to establish a more permanent settlement than Leif had managed. They built houses, explored the land, and began to trade with the indigenous people they called Skraelings. For a while, things went well. The land was rich and fertile, the hunting was good, and it seemed that the Norse might be able to establish a lasting colony in this new world. But tensions developed, both within the Norse community and with the Skraelings. The sources are unclear about exactly what sparked the conflict, but we know that fighting broke out between the Norse and the indigenous people. The Skraelings attacked the Norse settlement in force, and though the Norse were fierce fighters, they were vastly outnumbered. It was during this battle that Freydis performed the act for which she is best remembered. The Norse fighters were being driven back, starting to retreat toward their ships. The situation was desperate, and it looked like the Skraelings would overrun the settlement entirely. The Norsemen, for all their vaunted courage, were falling back in disorder. Freydis, who was pregnant at the time, was moving toward the ships with the others when she saw what was happening. She stopped and turned to face the approaching enemy. According to the saga that records this event, she called out to the retreating men, "Why do you run away from such worthless creatures, you who seem to me capable of slaughtering them like so many cattle? If I had weapons, I think I could fight better than any of you." The men kept retreating, so Freydis took matters into her own hands. She found a sword from a fallen warrior and armed herself. But she was pregnant and couldn't move quickly. As the Skraelings approached, Freydis performed an act that was both shocking and brilliant. She bared her breast and slapped it with the flat of her sword, letting out a war cry that echoed across the battlefield. The Skraelings, seeing this heavily pregnant woman fearlessly attacking and performing such a strange and aggressive display, stopped in their tracks. They had never seen anything like this. The sight of Freydis, alone, pregnant, defiant, slapping her breast with a sword and screaming at them, was so unexpected and so fierce that it broke the momentum of their attack. They hesitated, then began to fall back, and the Norse were able to regroup and drive them off completely. Freydis had saved the colony through sheer audacity and courage. She had refused to accept defeat, had refused to run, and her refusal had inspired her companions and intimidated her enemies. It was not strength of arms that won the day but strength of spirit, the absolute refusal to surrender or show fear. There are other stories about Freydis, not all of them flattering. She could be ruthless and cruel, and some sources say she ordered the deaths of her own companions during a dispute over the Vinland settlement. Freydis was not a simple hero or a one-dimensional character. She was complex, capable of both tremendous courage and questionable actions. This makes her more interesting and, in a way, more human. Real people are not consistently heroic or consistently villainous. They are capable of both great and terrible acts, sometimes driven by circumstances, sometimes by their own natures. But the story of Freydis facing down an army while pregnant, refusing to retreat, using psychological warfare and sheer audacity to turn the tide of battle, remains inspiring regardless of what else she may have done. It shows us that courage is not about physical strength but about the refusal to give in to fear. Freydis was not the strongest person on that battlefield, but she was the most fearless, and her fearlessness changed the outcome of the fight. The story of Freydis also reminds us that Viking women were not passive or helpless. They could own property, divorce their husbands, and in some cases, take up arms and fight. This was unusual in medieval Europe, where women were generally confined to domestic roles and had few legal rights. The Vikings were far from perfect in their treatment of women, but they offered more opportunities and more respect than many other medieval cultures. For modern listeners, Freydis' story offers multiple lessons. It reminds us that courage comes in many forms and is not limited by gender. It shows us that sometimes the best weapon is not physical force but psychological impact, that intimidation and surprise can be more effective than strength. It teaches us that refusing to accept defeat, maintaining defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, can sometimes change outcomes that seem predetermined. Most importantly, perhaps, Freydis' story reminds us that we are capable of more than we think. When circumstances demand it, when our backs are against the wall, we can find reserves of courage we didn't know we had. We can face down our fears, can stand when others retreat, can find within ourselves a fierce determination that surprises even us. As you rest here tonight, let Freydis' courage watch over you. You are not facing an army of enemies, not standing alone on a battlefield. But you face your own challenges, your own fears, your own moments when you must choose between retreat and defiance. When those moments come, remember Freydis. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. Remember that sometimes one person's refusal to accept defeat can change everything. But tonight, you don't need to be defiant or fierce. Tonight, you can rest in the knowledge that you have faced your day with whatever courage it required, and now you can lay that burden down. Freydis stands watch, ensuring your safety while you sleep. Let your body relax. Let your mind quiet. Let yourself drift into the peaceful rest you have earned. Sleep well, brave listener, under the protection of the shield maiden who refused to retreat. In the long history of the Viking Age, which stretched from the late 8th century to the late 11th century, no figure better embodies both the glory and the ending of that era than Harald Hardrada, whose name means hard ruler or stern counsel. Harald's life was an epic that spanned the known world, from the frozen fjords of Norway to the sun-baked walls of Jerusalem, and his death marked the symbolic end of the Viking Age itself. Harald was born around the year 1015 in Norway, the half-brother of King Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf. As a young boy, Harald was present at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, where his half-brother King Olaf was killed fighting to maintain his rule over Norway. Harald, only 15 years old, fought in that battle and was badly wounded. He was carried from the battlefield by his retainers and managed to escape to Sweden, but he was now an exile, his half-brother dead, and his own future uncertain. Rather than accepting obscurity or trying to hide in Norway, young Harald made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would seek his fortune in distant lands, would make a name for himself through feats of arms, and would one day return to claim what he believed was his rightful place as King of Norway. This decision took him on one of the most remarkable journeys in medieval history. Harald traveled east, to the land of the Rus, the Viking settlements in what is now Russia and Ukraine. There he served in the army of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, fighting in campaigns against the Poles and other enemies. But even this was not adventure enough for the ambitious young warrior. He heard tales of great wealth and opportunity even farther east, in the Byzantine Empire, and so he and his companions traveled to Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world. In Constantinople, Harald joined the Varangian Guard, the elite unit of Norse warriors who served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor. The Varangian Guard was one of the most prestigious military units in the world, and service in it brought both wealth and fame. The guards were paid handsomely, and they were allowed to plunder enemy cities they conquered, taking all the wealth they could carry. Harald served in the Varangian Guard for many years, fighting in campaigns across the Mediterranean world. He fought in what is now Bulgaria, Sicily, and Syria. He participated in the capture of over 80 fortified cities. He even traveled to Jerusalem as a pilgrim warrior, visiting the holy sites and bathing in the River Jordan. Everywhere he went, his reputation grew. He was known as a fierce fighter, a brilliant tactician, and a man of unbreakable will. The stories of Harald's exploits in the Mediterranean became legendary. There's a tale, possibly apocryphal but telling nonetheless, of how Harald captured a city in Sicily using cunning rather than force. The city was heavily fortified and seemed impossible to take by assault. So Harald captured birds that nested in the city walls, attached flaming chips of wood to their legs, and released them. The birds flew back to their nests in the walls, setting the city ablaze from within. Whether this actually happened or not, it demonstrates the kind of cleverness and unconventional thinking that Harald was known for. Through his service in the Varangian Guard, Harald accumulated enormous wealth. He sent much of this back to Yaroslav in Kiev for safekeeping, building up a fortune that would later help him buy support when he returned to Norway. But Harald wanted more than wealth. He wanted power, specifically the throne of Norway, which he believed was rightfully his as King Olaf's half-brother. Around 1042, Harald left Constantinople and the Varangian Guard. The circumstances of his departure are murky. Some sources say he left with honor, having completed his service. Others suggest he had to flee, having fallen out with the emperor. Either way, he returned to Kiev, collected his fortune, and began to plan his return to Norway. But first, he married. His bride was Elisif, daughter of Yaroslav, which gave Harald a powerful alliance with the Rus. With his bride, his treasure, and a force of loyal warriors, Harald finally returned to Norway in 1046, after 16 years away. The young wounded boy who had fled the battle at Stiklestad returned as a wealthy, famous, and formidable man in his prime, ready to claim a throne. Norway at that time was ruled by Magnus the Good, Harald's nephew. Harald demanded a share of the kingdom, and after some negotiation and the threat of civil war, Magnus agreed to rule jointly with Harald. But this arrangement didn't last long. Magnus died in 1047, and Harald became sole king of Norway, a position he would hold for the next 19 years. As king, Harald lived up to his name, hard ruler. He was stern and uncompromising, determined to make Norway strong and to expand its power. He fought wars against Denmark, trying to add that kingdom to his realm. He centralized power, reducing the independence of local chiefs and jarls. Not everyone loved Harald. Many found him too harsh, too demanding, but all respected his strength and his determination. For 19 years, Harald ruled Norway with an iron hand. He made the kingdom more powerful and more unified than it had been in generations. But he was not content. Like many great men, Harald was driven by ambition that could never be fully satisfied. He looked across the North Sea to England, where the succession was in dispute, and he saw an opportunity for one final, great adventure. In 1066, the King of England, Edward the Confessor, died without a clear heir. Several men claimed the throne, including Harald Hardrada, who argued that he had a claim through a previous agreement between Magnus of Norway and Harthacnut of England. Harald gathered a massive invasion force, said to be 300 ships carrying somewhere between 9,000 and 15,000 warriors, and sailed for England. This was to be the last great Viking invasion of England, and it seemed at first like it would be successful. Harald and his army landed in northern England and won a significant victory at the Battle of Fulford, defeating the northern English earls and capturing the city of York. For a brief moment, it seemed that Harald might succeed, that the Viking Age might not be over after all. But then King Harold Godwin, son of England, who had been in the south preparing to fight off an expected invasion from Normandy, heard of Harald Hardrada's landing. Harald gathered his army and force marched north, covering nearly 200 miles in just 5 days, an extraordinary feat of logistics and endurance. Harald Hardrada was at a place called Stamford Bridge when he learned that King Harold's army was approaching. The Viking army was unprepared, having left their armor on their ships because the day was warm. Many of Harold's men were scattered, foraging for supplies or resting. But there was no time to prepare properly. The two armies would meet immediately. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was fierce and bloody. The English attacked with the fury of men defending their homeland. The Vikings fought with the courage of warriors who knew they might be about to die. Harald Hardrada, now over 50 years old but still a formidable warrior, led from the front as he always had. He wielded his great sword and cut down many English soldiers. But then an arrow found him. Different sources placed the arrow's entry in his throat or in his chest, but the result was the same. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, the man who had traveled farther and seen more than almost any of his contemporaries, the warrior who had fought from Jerusalem to Norway, fell dead on an English battlefield. His dream of conquering England died with him. With Harald dead, the battle turned decisively against the Vikings. His son Olaf, who had come with the army, tried to rally the troops, but it was hopeless. The Norwegian army was destroyed. Of the 300 ships that had brought them to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was a catastrophic defeat, and it marked the end of the Viking Age. Never again would a Norwegian king lead a major invasion of England. The story of Harald Hardrada is both inspiring and cautionary. It shows us a man of tremendous courage, determination, and ability. Harald rose from being a wounded boy fleeing a lost battle to becoming a famous warrior, a commander of elite troops, and eventually a king. He traveled the known world, accumulated vast wealth, won countless battles, and ruled Norway for nearly 2 decades. By any reasonable measure, his life was a spectacular success. And yet, it wasn't enough for him. Harald could not be content with what he had achieved. He had to have more, had to pursue one final conquest. And that final ambition killed him. If Harald had stayed in Norway, if he had been content with the kingdom he had built and ruled, he would have died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by his family, remembered as one of Norway's greatest kings. Instead, he died on a foreign battlefield, his army destroyed, his final ambition unfulfilled. But perhaps Harald wouldn't have wanted it any other way. He was not a man who could sit still, who could be content with what he had. He was driven always to seek more, to test himself, to push the boundaries of what was possible. His death in battle was more fitting for him than dying peacefully of old age would have been. He died as he had lived, as a warrior, fighting for glory and power. For those of us listening to his story tonight, Harald Hardrada offers several lessons. He shows us that one person, through courage and determination, can accomplish extraordinary things, can rise from obscurity to greatness. He shows us that ambition can be a powerful force for achievement, driving us to heights we might not otherwise reach. But he also shows us the danger of ambition that knows no limits, of never being satisfied, of always needing more. The question each of us must answer is, how much is enough? When do we stop striving and start appreciating what we have? Harald never found that balance, and it cost him everything in the end. We can admire his courage and his achievements while also learning from his ultimate failure to know when to be content. As you rest here tonight, think about what you have achieved, what you have built, what you have earned. Let yourself feel satisfaction in these things. Let yourself be content, at least for tonight, with where you are. Ambition has its place, and tomorrow you can pursue your goals again. But tonight is for rest, for satisfaction, for peace. Harald Hardrada's restless spirit can watch over you without disturbing you. Let his courage inspire you, but let his fate also remind you that rest and contentment have value too. Breathe deeply. Let your body sink into comfort. You are not on a battlefield, not chasing after glory or power. You are simply here, simply resting, and that is enough. That is more than enough. Harald's story is told, and now you can sleep under the protection of the last great Viking king, who even in his failure was magnificent. Sleep well, brave listener, and may you wake with some of Harald's courage but also with wisdom about when to strive and when to rest. In a culture dominated by tales of warriors and kings, battles and conquests, the story of Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir stands out as something different yet equally heroic. Gudrid was not a shield maiden or a ruler or a conqueror, but she may have traveled farther than any woman of her time, and possibly farther than most men. Her courage was not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage of exploration, of facing the unknown, of building new lives in strange lands. She is remembered as Gudrid the Far Traveler, and her story reminds us that there are many kinds of heroism. Gudrid was born around 970 in Iceland, the daughter of a prosperous farmer. Her early life was unremarkable by Viking standards. She learned the skills that women of her class needed to know, and she was known for her beauty, intelligence, and practical nature. But Gudrid's life would become extraordinary because of her courage, her adaptability, and perhaps most importantly, her willingness to embrace change rather than fear it. When Gudrid was still young, her father decided to join an expedition to Greenland. Erik the Red had established settlements there, and word had spread back to Iceland that there was good land available for those brave enough to make the journey. Gudrid's father, seeing opportunity, decided to go, and Gudrid went with him. This was her first great journey, crossing the dangerous waters between Iceland and Greenland, a voyage that claimed many lives. The journey did not go smoothly. Gudrid's father's ship was blown off course and spent the summer lost at sea, running short of food and water. When they finally made landfall in Greenland, it was late in the season, and they were in desperate condition. They were taken in by Erik the Red's family, but many of the ship's company, including Gudrid's father, died during that winter from disease and hardship. Gudrid found herself alone in a strange land, without family or resources. Many people in such a situation would have given up or simply accepted whatever fate was handed to them. But Gudrid was resilient and resourceful. She married Thorstein Eriksson, one of Erik the Red's sons, which gave her security and status. But this marriage was short-lived. Thorstein decided to lead an expedition to Vinland, the new land his brother Leif had discovered, but the expedition went badly. They became lost, never reached Vinland, and Thorstein fell ill and died. Gudrid was widowed and alone again, but she had earned the respect of Greenland society through her courage and her practical abilities. She married again, this time to a wealthy merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni. Together, they decided to attempt what Thorstein had failed to do, establish a permanent settlement in Vinland, the mysterious land to the west. Gudrid and Thorfinn gathered a large expedition, including several ships, over 100 people, and livestock. They sailed to Vinland and established a settlement there. And it was in Vinland that Gudrid gave birth to a son named Snorri, who is believed to be the first European child born in the Americas. Gudrid thus achieved something that no other European woman of her time could claim. She gave birth in the New World, almost 500 years before Columbus would discover it. The settlement in Vinland faced many challenges. There were conflicts with the indigenous Skraelings, difficulties with supplies, and tensions within the Norse community itself. After 3 years, the decision was made to abandon the settlement and return to Greenland. Some might see this as a failure, but Gudrid had achieved something remarkable. She had lived in the New World, had raised a child there, and had survived challenges that would have broken many others. But Gudrid's travels were not over. She and Thorfinn eventually left Greenland and returned to Iceland, where they established a farm. Thorfinn died some years later, and Gudrid, now widowed for the third time, could have settled into quiet old age. But instead, she decided to make one final great journey. Gudrid became deeply religious in her later years and decided to make a pilgrimage to Rome, to visit the center of Christendom and receive the Pope's blessing. This was an extraordinary undertaking for anyone in the 11th century, and especially for a woman. The journey from Iceland to Rome was long, dangerous, and expensive. It required traveling through multiple kingdoms, crossing dangerous waters and treacherous mountain passes, dealing with foreign languages and customs. But Gudrid had spent her life traveling and adapting to new situations. She made the journey to Rome, met with the Pope, and received his blessing. Then she returned to Iceland, where she retired to a monastery and lived out her final years in prayer and contemplation. She died around 1050, having traveled farther than almost anyone of her time, from Iceland to Greenland to North America to Rome and back. Gudrid's story is remarkable for several reasons. First, it demonstrates that women in Viking society could be adventurers and explorers just as men could. Gudrid was not forced to make her journeys, she chose them. She could have stayed in Iceland after her father died, could have remained in Greenland, could have lived quietly after Thorfinn's death. But at each stage of her life, she chose movement over stasis, adventure over security, the unknown over the familiar. Second, Gudrid's story shows a different kind of courage than we see in tales of warriors and battles. Gudrid's courage was the courage of resilience, of adapting to loss and change, of building new lives again and again after experiencing tragedy. She was widowed 3 times, lost her father, saw settlements fail, and faced dangers most of us can barely imagine. Yet she never gave up, never stopped moving forward, never lost her fundamental optimism and faith. Third, Gudrid's story reminds us that exploration and adventure are not just about conquest or wealth but about curiosity, about the desire to see what's beyond the horizon, to experience new things, to challenge oneself. Gudrid didn't journey to Vinland or Rome for glory or gold, but because she wanted to see these places, to experience these things, to push herself beyond her comfort zone. Finally, Gudrid's story demonstrates the power of adaptability. She lived in Iceland, Greenland, Vinland, and traveled through Europe. She adapted to each new environment, learned what was needed to survive and thrive in each place. In our own lives, we face many changes, many new situations that demand adaptation. Gudrid's example shows us that we can meet these challenges, can adapt and overcome, can find ways to thrive even in unfamiliar circumstances. For modern listeners, Gudrid offers a particularly relevant kind of heroism. Most of us will never fight in a battle or lead an army. But many of us will face loss, change, and the need to adapt to new circumstances. We will need the kind of courage that Gudrid showed, the courage to keep going after setbacks, to build new lives after old ones fall apart, to see opportunity in change rather than just threat. Gudrid's story also reminds us that adventure and heroism are available to everyone, not just warriors or rulers. You don't need to be the strongest or the most skilled fighter to live an extraordinary life. You need curiosity, courage, resilience, and the willingness to step beyond your comfort zone. These are qualities we can all cultivate, capacities we all have within us. As you rest here tonight, think of Gudrid the far traveler, who journeyed farther than almost anyone of her time, who faced loss and hardship with resilience and grace, who never stopped moving forward. You too are on a journey, though your path may not take you across oceans or to distant continents. You face your own challenges, your own changes, your own opportunities to demonstrate courage and resilience. But tonight, you don't need to journey anywhere. Tonight, you can rest in one place, can be still and peaceful. Gudrid's restless spirit watches over you, protecting your rest even as she embodies the principle of movement and change. You have traveled far enough today. Now it's time to be still, to sink into comfort, to let sleep claim you. Breathe slowly and deeply. Feel your body becoming heavier, more relaxed. You are safe here, comfortable here. Tomorrow you can resume your own journey, whatever that may be. But tonight, under the protection of the far traveler, you can rest completely. Sleep well, brave listener, and may you wake with some of Gudrid's courage, resilience, and readiness to face whatever journeys await you. The Viking Age was a time of transformation, not just politically and militarily but spiritually. The Old Norse gods, Odin and Thor and Freyr, were gradually giving way to Christianity, and this transition was neither smooth nor peaceful. One of the most dramatic figures in this transformation was Olaf Tryggvason, King of Norway, who used both persuasion and force to convert his people to the new faith. His story is one of conviction, courage, and controversy, a reminder that heroism can be complex and that great men are not always good men, even when they believe they are doing good. Olaf was born around 960, the son of Tryggva Olafsson, a regional king in Norway who was killed when Olaf was still an infant. The boy was taken by his mother and a guardian to flee Norway, and they ended up in what is now Russia. During the journey, Olaf's guardian was captured by pirates, and Olaf himself was sold into slavery. He spent years as a slave in Estonia before being discovered by a relative who recognized him and bought his freedom. Even as a young boy sold into slavery, Olaf showed signs of the strength and determination that would mark his later life. He endured his slavery without being broken by it, maintained his sense of identity, and when opportunity came for freedom, he seized it. He made his way to the court of Prince Vladimir of Kiev, where he entered service as a warrior. Olaf grew to be a formidable fighter, tall and strong, skilled with all weapons. He led raids across the Baltic and began to accumulate wealth and reputation. But something else happened to Olaf during these years. He converted to Christianity. The sources differ on exactly how this happened. Some say he was converted by a Christian hermit in the Scilly Isles. Others say he had a vision or a profound spiritual experience. Whatever the cause, Olaf became not just a Christian but a zealous one, convinced that the Old Norse gods were false and that Christianity was the one true faith. Around 995, Olaf returned to Norway with a fleet and an army. The country was in disorder, with no strong central ruler, and Olaf saw an opportunity. Using his military skill and the support of some Norwegian chiefs, Olaf made himself king. Once in power, he set about achieving his great goal, converting Norway to Christianity by any means necessary. Olaf's methods were effective but brutal. He traveled throughout Norway, calling assemblies where he would preach Christianity and demand that the people be baptized. Those who agreed were baptized and richly rewarded. Those who refused faced terrible consequences. Olaf would torture and execute those who resisted conversion. He destroyed temples to the old gods, smashed idols, and killed priests who served the Norse deities. In one famous incident, Olaf confronted Rord the Strong, a powerful chieftain who refused to convert. Olaf offered Rord wealth and position if he would accept Christianity, but Rord steadfastly refused, declaring his loyalty to Thor and Odin. Olaf had Rord tortured to death in a particularly horrible manner, forcing a snake down his throat. This brutality was meant to terrify others into conversion, and it often worked. Many Norwegians accepted baptism out of fear, even if they privately continued to honor the old gods. This raises difficult questions about Olaf's heroism. He was certainly courageous. It takes tremendous courage to stand up for one's beliefs, to try to change an entire nation's religion. He was certainly determined and effective. By the time of his death, much of Norway had at least nominally converted to Christianity. But can we call someone heroic when their methods involve torture and murder of those who simply wanted to practice their ancestral religion? The Vikings themselves had complicated feelings about Olaf. Many resented his forced conversions and saw him as a tyrant. But others genuinely appreciated the new faith he brought, believed that Christianity was better than the old ways, and saw Olaf as a savior who had delivered them from paganism. History is full of such complicated figures, people who did things we might consider terrible in service of goals they considered righteous. But Olaf was more than just a religious zealot. He was also a skilled king who strengthened Norway's defenses, established better laws, and improved trade. He was a patron of poets and artisans. He built churches and promoted learning. If he had lived longer, he might have been able to build on these accomplishments and be remembered as one of Norway's greatest kings. But Olaf's reign lasted only 5 years. His forced conversions had made him many enemies, both among those Norwegians who still clung to the old faith and among neighboring rulers who saw him as a threat. In the year 1000, a coalition of his enemies gathered a fleet and confronted Olaf at the Battle of Svolder. Olaf's fleet was vastly outnumbered, but the king refused to flee or surrender. He called his ships together and prepared for battle. The fighting was fierce and lasted for hours. Olaf fought from the deck of his flagship, the Long Serpent, one of the largest warships ever built. One by one, Olaf's ships were overwhelmed and captured, until only the Long Serpent remained, surrounded by enemy vessels. The end came when the enemy ships grappled the Long Serpent on all sides and began boarding it. Olaf fought furiously, cutting down many enemies, but the outcome was inevitable. When he saw that all was lost, that his ship would soon be captured and he would be taken prisoner, Olaf made a final choice. Rather than be captured alive, rather than be paraded as a defeated enemy or forced to renounce his faith, Olaf leaped into the sea. He was wearing full armor, which dragged him down immediately. His body was never recovered. Some said he died quickly, drowning in the cold waters of the Baltic. Others insisted that he survived somehow, that he swam to shore and escaped, living out his days as an anonymous monk in a distant monastery. But most likely, Olaf died as he had lived, defiantly choosing his own fate rather than accepting what others would impose on him. Olaf Tryggvason's story raises important questions about the nature of heroism and the relationship between means and ends. He believed absolutely that he was doing the right thing, that converting Norway to Christianity was a sacred mission that justified any action. By his own standards and the standards of his faith, he was a hero, a man who sacrificed everything to bring salvation to his people. But by other standards, including those of the people he forcibly converted, he was a tyrant who destroyed their ancestral traditions and murdered those who resisted. The same actions that make him a saint in some tellings make him a villain in others. History is full of such complications, and we must learn to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to understand that people can be both heroic and terrible, often for the same actions. For those listening tonight, Olaf's story offers several lessons. It reminds us that conviction and courage, while admirable in themselves, must be tempered with mercy and respect for others. It shows us that believing absolutely in the rightness of our cause can lead us to commit terrible acts. It teaches us that there are limits to what we should do even in pursuit of goals we consider righteous. But Olaf's story also shows us the power of absolute commitment, of being willing to die rather than compromise our core beliefs. When Olaf leaped into the sea rather than surrender, he demonstrated a kind of courage that commands respect even from those who disagree with him. He chose death over betraying what he believed in, and there is something admirable in that choice, even if we question the beliefs that led to it. As you rest here tonight, think about your own convictions, your own beliefs. What would you be willing to die for? What principles are so core to your identity that you would never compromise them? These are important questions, worth contemplating. But also ask yourself, how do I pursue my goals? Do I respect those who disagree with me? Do I allow others the freedom to choose their own paths? But these heavy questions can wait for tomorrow's light. Tonight is for rest, for letting go of the day's struggles and controversies. Olaf's fierce commitment to his faith need not disturb your peace. Instead, let his courage at the end, his refusal to surrender even in defeat, inspire you to face your own challenges with dignity and strength. But for now, those challenges are distant. Now is only rest. Breathe deeply and slowly. Feel your body relaxing, tension draining away. You are safe and comfortable, free to rest without fear. Olaf's story is told, and now you can sleep in peace, knowing that whatever your own beliefs and convictions, you have the courage within you to stand for them when necessary. Sleep well, brave listener, and may you find the balance between conviction and compassion, between standing firm and showing mercy. To be the son of a legend is both a blessing and a burden. You inherit a famous name, which opens doors and creates opportunities, but you also inherit expectations that can be crushing. People will always compare you to your father, will always wonder if you measure up. Bjorn Ironside, one of the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, faced these challenges and met them by carving out his own legend, by taking Viking raiders to places they had never been before, and by proving that he was every bit his father's son. Bjorn was born around 830, one of several sons that Ragnar had with his second wife Aslauge. From his earliest years, Bjorn heard stories of his father's exploits, of the dragon he had slain, of the raids he had led, of the treasure he had won. These stories were both inspiring and intimidating. How could any son hope to match such deeds? But Bjorn was not the type to be paralyzed by his father's shadow. Instead, he was determined to create his own legend. As a young man, Bjorn participated in the Great Heathen Army's invasion of England, the massive Viking force that his brothers assembled to avenge their father Ragnar's death. Bjorn fought bravely in the conquest of England, proving his worth as a warrior. But conquering England, while impressive, was not enough for Bjorn. Others had raided England before. His own father had raided England. Bjorn wanted to do something new, something that would make his own name legendary. So Bjorn conceived of an audacious plan. He would lead a fleet south, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and raid the Mediterranean. Vikings had occasionally ventured into the Mediterranean before, but never in the numbers Bjorn envisioned, never with the goal of reaching the ancient cities of the south. Some said it was madness. The Mediterranean was far away, controlled by powerful kingdoms, and filled with dangers that northern warriors knew nothing about. But Bjorn was determined. Around the year 859, Bjorn and his co-commander Hastín assembled a fleet of over 60 ships and thousands of warriors. They sailed from the coasts of Francia, down past Spain, and through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean Sea. It must have been an extraordinary moment for those Vikings, sailing into waters that seemed to belong to another world, under skies hotter and brighter than anything they had known in the north. The Viking fleet raided along the coasts of North Africa and Spain, capturing slaves and treasure. They attacked the Moorish city of Algeciras and sacked numerous coastal settlements. The Mediterranean powers were shocked and unprepared for these northern raiders. Their defenses were oriented toward fighting other Mediterranean powers, not dealing with swift-moving dragon ships that could appear anywhere along the coast. But Bjorn had an even more ambitious goal. He wanted to raid Rome itself, the Eternal City, the center of Christianity, the greatest city in the Western world. Reaching Rome would be a feat that would eclipse even his father's achievements. Bjorn and his fleet sailed up the western coast of Italy, searching for Rome. This is where history and legend begin to blur. According to some sources, Bjorn and his men came to a beautiful city with white marble buildings and thought they had reached Rome. They laid siege to the city but found it too well defended to take by assault. So Bjorn devised a clever stratagem. He sent messengers to the city, claiming that he was dying and wished to be baptized as a Christian before death. He asked that priests be allowed to come to his ship to perform the sacrament. The city's authorities, moved by piety or perhaps simply foolish, agreed. Priests came to Bjorn's ship and performed a baptism. Bjorn then died, and his men asked permission to bring his body into the city to be buried in consecrated ground. Again, the authorities agreed, and a funeral procession was allowed to enter the city, carrying Bjorn's body in a coffin. But it was all a ruse. Once inside the city walls, Bjorn leaped from his coffin, very much alive, and his men threw off their mourning garb to reveal weapons hidden beneath. They opened the city gates from within, allowing the rest of the Viking force to pour in. The city was sacked thoroughly, with the Vikings carrying off enormous amounts of treasure. The only problem was that this wasn't Rome at all. The city they had captured was actually Luna, a much smaller Italian city that the Vikings had mistaken for Rome in their ignorance of Mediterranean geography. When Bjorn realized the mistake, he was supposedly furious, but there was nothing to be done about it. They were too far from the real Rome to make another attempt, and Luna's treasure, while substantial, was nothing compared to what Rome would have held. Whether this story is true or just a legend that grew up around Bjorn's Mediterranean expedition is unclear. But what is certain is that Bjorn and his fleet did raid extensively in the Mediterranean, did capture substantial treasure, and did manage to survive the expedition and return to Scandinavia. Many of his ships were lost, and many of his men died, but Bjorn himself returned, now known as Bjorn Ironside for his strength and his seeming invulnerability in battle. The Mediterranean expedition made Bjorn famous throughout the Viking world. He had taken his raiders farther south than any Viking army had gone before. He had defied expectations and accomplished something extraordinary. He had stepped out of his father's shadow and created his own legend. When people spoke of Bjorn Ironside, they spoke of his deeds, not just his father's. After his return, Bjorn became a king in Sweden, ruling in Uppsala. He married, had children, and lived to a good age for a Viking warrior. He was remembered as one of the greatest of Ragnar's sons, perhaps even the greatest, though his brothers would have contested that claim. When Bjorn died, he was buried in a great mound that still exists in Sweden, a physical reminder of his legendary status. Bjorn Ironside's story speaks to several important themes. First, it reminds us that we can honor our parents and our heritage while still creating our own path. Bjorn didn't try to simply repeat his father's deeds. Instead, he looked for new challenges, new frontiers, new ways to prove himself. He respected his father's legacy but wasn't imprisoned by it. Second, Bjorn's story shows us the value of audacious goals. Leading a fleet to the Mediterranean was crazy. Most people told him so. But Bjorn did it anyway, and though he didn't achieve everything he set out to do, he never reached Rome. He still accomplished something remarkable that earned him lasting fame. Sometimes attempting the impossible and falling short is better than never trying at all. Third, the story reminds us that cleverness and strategy are as important as strength. Whether the lunar story is true or not, it embodies the Viking ideal of using brains as well as brawn. Bjorn was called Ironside for his strength and toughness, but he was also known for his cunning and his ability to adapt to new situations. Finally, Bjorn's story is about the universal human desire to make our own mark, to be known for our own achievements rather than just as someone's son or daughter. This is a challenge many people face, especially those born into famous families or those who live in the shadow of accomplished parents. Bjorn shows us that it's possible to acknowledge that shadow while still finding our own place in the sun. As you rest here tonight, think about your own legacy, your own mark on the world. You may not be raiding distant cities or commanding fleets, but you are creating your own story, making your own choices, building your own reputation. Like Bjorn, you are not defined solely by where you came from or who your parents were. You are defined by what you choose to do, by how you face challenges, by the courage and cleverness you bring to your own life's journey. But tonight, the journey can wait. Tonight, you can rest from your efforts, can let go of the need to prove yourself or achieve or accomplish. Bjorn Ironside stands watch over your rest, his courage and his achievements a shield around you while you sleep. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your body grow heavy and relaxed. Let your mind quiet, releasing the day's concerns. You have traveled far enough today, have accomplished enough. Now it's time to rest, to renew your strength for tomorrow's challenges. Sleep well, brave listener, under the protection of Bjorn Ironside, who sailed farther than any of his people had gone before and who proved that you can honor your heritage while still creating your own destiny. Rest now in peace, and may you wake tomorrow ready to continue writing your own legend. Finally, Bjorn's story is about the universal human desire to make our own mark, to be known for our own achievements rather than just as someone's son or daughter. This is a challenge many people face, especially those born into famous families or those who live in the shadow of accomplished parents. Bjorn shows us that it's possible to acknowledge that shadow while still finding our own place in the sun. As you rest here tonight, think about your own legacy, your own mark on the world. You may not be raiding distant cities or commanding fleets, but you are creating your own story, making your own choices, building your own reputation. Like Bjorn, you are not defined solely by where you came from or who your parents were. You are defined by what you choose to do, by how you face challenges, by the courage and cleverness you bring to your own life's journey. But tonight, the journey can wait. Tonight, you can rest from your efforts, can let go of the need to prove yourself or achieve or accomplish. Bjorn Ironside stands watch over your rest, his courage and his achievements a shield around you while you sleep. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your body grow heavy and relaxed. Let your mind quiet, releasing the day's concerns. You have traveled far enough today, have accomplished enough. Now it's time to rest, to renew your strength for tomorrow's challenges. Sleep well, brave listener, under the protection of Bjorn Ironside, who sailed farther than any of his people had gone before and who proved that you can honor your heritage while still creating your own destiny. Rest now in peace, and may you wake tomorrow ready to continue writing your own legend. Finally, Bjorn's story is about the universal human desire to make our own mark, to be known for our own achievements rather than just as someone's son or daughter. This is a challenge many people face, especially those born into famous families or those who live in the shadow of accomplished parents. Bjorn shows us that it's possible to acknowledge that shadow while still finding our own place in the sun. As you rest here tonight, think about your own legacy, your own mark on the world. You may not be raiding distant cities or commanding fleets, but you are creating your own story, making your own choices, building your own reputation. Like Bjorn, you are not defined solely by where you came from or who your parents were. You are defined by what you choose to do, by how you face challenges, by the courage and cleverness you bring to your own life's journey. But tonight, the journey can wait. Tonight, you can rest from your efforts, can let go of the need to prove yourself or achieve or accomplish. Bjorn Ironside stands watch over your rest, his courage and his achievements a shield around you while you sleep. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your body grow heavy and relaxed. Let your mind quiet, releasing the day's concerns. You have traveled far enough today, have accomplished enough. Now it's time to rest, to renew your strength for tomorrow's challenges. Sleep well, brave listener, under the protection of Bjorn Ironside, who sailed farther than any of his people had gone before and who proved that you can honor your heritage while still creating your own destiny. Rest now in peace, and may you wake tomorrow ready to continue writing your own legend. Among all the shield maidens whose stories have come down to us from the Viking Age, none is more famous or more inspiring than Lagertha, first wife of Ragnar Lothbrok and a warrior and ruler in her own right. Lagertha's story reminds us that in Viking society, women could be more than just wives and mothers. They could be warriors, could lead armies, could rule kingdoms, and their courage and skill were respected and honored. Lagertha first appears in the historical record in the work of the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote in the late 12th century. According to Saxo, Lagertha was a skilled warrior who fought in a battle in Norway. The Norwegian king Fro had invaded Sweden and killed the Swedish king, and then he had the Swedish king's women, including noble women and royalty, placed in a brothel to humiliate them. When Ragnar Lothbrok heard of this outrage, he sailed to Norway with an army to avenge the Swedish king and rescue the imprisoned women. The women, rather than waiting passively to be rescued, armed themselves and joined the battle. Lagertha was among them, and she fought with such skill and ferocity that she drew Ragnar's attention immediately. Saxo writes that she had a man's courage and fought in the front of the battle, and that her hair flew loose behind her as she fought. Ragnar was so impressed by her prowess in battle that after the victory, he sought her out and asked for her hand in marriage. But Lagertha was not easily won. To test Ragnar's worthiness, she set a fierce bear and a savage dog to guard her home. Ragnar would have to defeat these beasts if he wanted to court her. This was a test of both courage and cleverness, and Ragnar passed it, killing the bear with his spear and the dog with his bare hands. Lagertha agreed to marry him, and they had 2 daughters and a son together. The marriage between Lagertha and Ragnar was one of equals. She was not merely his wife but his partner in both war and peace. When Ragnar went on raids, Lagertha often fought beside him. When he made strategic decisions, she counseled him. She was respected by his warriors and feared by his enemies. In a culture that valued martial prowess above almost everything else, Lagertha had proven herself repeatedly. But the marriage did not last. According to the sources, Ragnar fell in love with another woman, Thora, and divorced Lagertha to marry her. In Viking society, divorce was relatively straightforward and carried no particular stigma, but it must still have been painful for Lagertha. She had fought beside Ragnar, had borne his children, had been his equal partner. Now she was being cast aside for a younger woman who had not proven herself in battle. But Lagertha did not spend her time lamenting her lost marriage. Instead, she returned to Norway and married a powerful jarl, or earl, and when this husband proved cruel and tyrannical, Lagertha killed him with a spear that she had hidden in her clothing and took his power for herself. She became a jarl in her own right, ruling her territory with wisdom and strength, commanding warriors, settling disputes, and defending her land against enemies. Years later, when Ragnar found himself in a difficult civil war in Denmark, he sent messengers to many of his former allies, asking for aid. He sent messengers to Lagertha as well, not knowing if she would help the man who had divorced her. Lagertha could have refused, could have let Ragnar fight his own battles, could have taken satisfaction in his difficulties. But she chose differently. This doesn't mean that Viking society was egalitarian or feminist by modern standards. Most women in Viking society did not become warriors or rulers. The vast majority lived more traditional lives, managing households and raising children. But the fact that women like Lagertha were possible, that they were accepted and even celebrated, tells us something important about Viking culture. It tells us that they valued ability and courage over gender, that they were willing to respect a woman who could prove herself by their standards. Lagertha's story also speaks to the theme of female autonomy and self-determination. When Ragnar divorced her, she didn't fade into obscurity or define herself by that rejection. She built a new life, took power in her own right, and continued to be a force to be reckoned with. When Ragnar asked her to remarry him, she refused because she had her own life and her own power and didn't need him. This is a remarkably modern sensibility for a story that is over 800 years old. For modern listeners, especially women but really for anyone, Lagertha's story offers powerful lessons. It reminds us that we are not defined by our relationships, that we can recover from rejection and loss and build new lives. It shows us that helping someone who has hurt us doesn't mean we're weak or that we need to reconcile with them. We can be generous and honorable while still maintaining our boundaries and our independence. Lagertha also reminds us that strength and femininity are not opposites, that a woman can be both a skilled warrior and a wise ruler, both fierce and compassionate, both strong and feminine. The Vikings understood this instinctively. They didn't see Lagertha's martial skills as making her less of a woman. She was a woman and a warrior, and there was no contradiction in that. Most importantly, perhaps, Lagertha's story teaches us about living on our own terms. She didn't let others define her. When she was married to Ragnar, she was his equal partner, not his subordinate. When he divorced her, she built her own power rather than accepting a lesser position. When she aided him in battle, it was her choice, motivated by honor rather than obligation or residual affection. Throughout her life, Lagertha made her own choices and lived with their consequences, maintaining her agency and her dignity. As you rest here tonight, let Lagertha's fierce independence and courage inspire you. You too are more than your relationships, more than others' opinions of you, more than the roles others try to assign you. You have your own strength, your own power, your own path. Tomorrow you can continue walking that path, making your own choices, building your own life. But tonight, you can rest, knowing that you are strong enough to face whatever comes. Breathe deeply and slowly. Feel the tension draining from your body. Lagertha's warrior spirit watches over you, protecting your rest even as she embodies strength and determination. You are safe, you are strong, and you are exactly where you need to be. Let yourself drift now into peaceful sleep, under the protection of the Shield Maiden who proved that courage knows no gender, that strength comes in many forms, and that the most important thing is to live on your own terms with honor and dignity. Sleep well, brave listener, and may you face tomorrow with some of Lagertha's fierce independence, some of her unshakable courage, and all of her determination to live life on her own terms. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with ambition or desire for glory but with necessity, with having no other choice but to venture into the unknown. Erik the Red, one of the most famous Viking explorers, began his journey to Greenland not because he wanted to explore but because he had been exiled and had nowhere else to go. Yet from this inauspicious beginning came one of the great exploration stories of the Viking Age, the discovery and settlement of Greenland, and the foundation for even more distant explorations by Erik's children. Erik was born in Norway around 950, the son of Thorvald Asvaldsson. His family had problems with violence and the law from the beginning. Erik's father was exiled from Norway for killing a man, and the family fled to Iceland, where they settled in the harsh northwestern part of the island. Erik grew up in this rough environment, learning to be tough and self-reliant, but also apparently inheriting his father's quick temper and tendency toward violence. When Erik was grown and had his own farm in Iceland, he became involved in a dispute with a neighbor over some wooden bench boards that had been loaned and not returned. The dispute escalated, as disputes between proud Vikings often did, and Erik ended up killing 2 of his neighbor's sons. For this crime, Erik was sentenced to a lesser outlawry, a 3-year exile from his district of Iceland. Erik moved to another part of Iceland, but violence followed him. He became involved in another dispute, this time over some carved wooden pillars that had been loaned to him. When the dispute turned violent, Erik killed 2 more men. This time, the penalty was more severe. Erik was declared a full outlaw, banished from all of Iceland for 3 years. This was a serious sentence. An outlaw had no legal protection. Anyone could kill him without penalty. He could not seek shelter or help from anyone, on pain of their being outlawed as well. Most outlaws fled to Norway or other settled lands, hoping to survive their exile and eventually return. But Erik the Red chose a different path. He had heard stories of land to the west of Iceland, glimpsed occasionally by ships blown off course in storms. No one had ever successfully settled there, and most Icelanders believed it was too harsh and barren to support human life. But Erik, with few other options, decided to investigate. In 982, Erik set out with a small crew in a single ship. They sailed west from Iceland, across dangerous waters filled with ice and prone to sudden storms. After several days, they sighted land, a massive island covered in glacier and ice. This was Greenland, though Erik didn't call it that at first. He spent the next 3 years exploring the coastline, looking for places that might be suitable for settlement. What Erik found surprised him. Though much of Greenland was covered in ice, the coastal areas in the south and west had stretches of relatively green land, with grass for livestock and some protection from the worst weather. There were fjords similar to those in Norway and Iceland, places where a settlement could be established. Erik spent his 3 years of exile carefully exploring these areas, noting which places had the best grazing, the best harbors, the best protection from wind and weather. When his 3 years of exile were up, Erik returned to Iceland with an ambitious plan. He would lead a settlement expedition to this new land, would establish permanent Norse communities there. But he needed to convince people to come with him, and that required persuasion. People were comfortable in Iceland, or at least as comfortable as anyone could be in that harsh land. Why would they risk everything to sail to an unknown island that might be even worse? This is where Erik showed not just courage but cleverness. He called his discovery Greenland, deliberately choosing a name that would make it sound appealing and attractive. If the land has a good name, he is reported to have said, people will want to go there. It was an early example of what we might today call marketing or public relations, and it worked. When Erik organized his settlement expedition in 985, 25 ships set out from Iceland, carrying hundreds of would-be settlers with their livestock, tools, and household goods. The voyage was difficult. Storms scattered the fleet, and only 14 ships reached Greenland. Some turned back to Iceland, and some were lost at sea. But enough arrived to establish 2 main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, that would persist for over 400 years. Erik established his own farm, which he called Brattahlid, and became the de facto leader of the Greenland Norse. Life in Greenland was hard. The growing season was short, and farming was difficult. The settlers relied heavily on livestock, particularly sheep and goats, and on hunting seals, caribou, and walrus. They traded walrus ivory and polar bear hides to Iceland and Norway in exchange for wood, iron, and other goods they couldn't produce themselves. But they survived, and over time, the settlements grew and prospered modestly. Erik ruled his settlements with the same forceful personality that had gotten him into trouble in Norway and Iceland. He was a strong leader, decisive and tough, but also fair in his own way. He settled disputes, organized community projects, and defended the settlement's interests. The people of Greenland respected him, not just because he had led them there but because he continued to lead them well once they arrived. Erik's greatest legacy, though, might be his children. His son Leif Erikson would become the first European to reach North America, establishing a settlement in Vinland. His daughter Freydis would travel to Vinland as well, showing the same fierce courage that her father possessed. His son Thorvald would explore farther along the North American coast, and his son Thorstein would attempt another Vinland voyage. Erik's exploration of Greenland opened the door to even greater explorations by the next generation. Erik himself never went to Vinland. According to the sagas, when Leif was planning his expedition, Erik agreed to go but fell from his horse on the way to the ship. Taking this as a bad omen, Erik decided to stay in Greenland. He died around the year 1003, probably of an illness, having lived to see his Greenland settlements firmly established and his son return safely from Vinland with tales of the New World to the west. Erik the Red story offers several important lessons. First, it shows us that necessity can be the mother of great achievements. Erik didn't set out to discover and settle Greenland because he was driven by scientific curiosity or a desire for glory. He went because he had been outlawed and needed somewhere to go. Yet from this desperate necessity came one of the great exploration achievements of the Viking Age. Second, Erik's story reminds us that leadership requires both strength and vision. Erik was certainly strong and forceful. He could be violent when he felt wronged, and he didn't back down from challenges. But he also had vision, could see possibilities where others saw only ice and barrenness. He could convince others to follow him into the unknown, could lead them through hardship, and could establish lasting settlements in a harsh new land. Third, the story shows us the importance of adaptability and resilience. Erik faced repeated setbacks and exiles, but he didn't give up or despair. Each time he was forced to move, he adapted to his new circumstances and found ways to thrive. When he was exiled from Iceland, he didn't just hide out somewhere for 3 years. He used that time productively, exploring and planning, turning his punishment into an opportunity. Finally, Erik's story reminds us that our legacies are often created not just by what we do ourselves but by what we enable others to do. Erik explored Greenland, but his children explored even farther. He established settlements that would last for centuries. He opened doors that led to discoveries he would never personally make. This is true for all of us. We build foundations that others will build upon, create opportunities that others will seize, inspire people who will go farther than we did. As you rest here tonight, think about Erik the Red, turned outlaw, sailing into the unknown because he had no choice, making the best of bad circumstances, building something lasting from unpromising materials. You too face challenges that you didn't choose, circumstances that seem unfair or difficult. But like Erik, you can adapt, can find opportunities even in hardship, can build something meaningful even when the conditions seem harsh. But tonight is not for building or striving. Tonight is for rest, for allowing your body and mind to recover and renew. Erik's powerful presence watches over you, the founder and explorer protecting your sleep. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your body grow heavy and relaxed. You have explored far enough today, have faced sufficient challenges. Now it's time to rest, to gather strength for whatever tomorrow brings. Sleep peacefully under the protection of Erik the Red, who turned exile into exploration, who built settlements in the harshest of lands, and who opened doors to discoveries he would never see. Rest now, brave listener, and may you wake with some of Erik's resilience, some of his ability to adapt and overcome, and some of his vision to see possibilities where others see only obstacles. Among all the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, perhaps none is more fascinating or more mysterious than Ivar the Boneless. His very name raises questions that have puzzled historians for centuries. Why was he called boneless? Was he disabled in some way, or did the name refer to something else entirely? The sources offer contradictory information, and the truth is lost to time. But what is clear is that Ivar was a military genius, a strategic mastermind who led one of the largest and most successful Viking invasions in history despite whatever physical limitations he may have had. According to the Norse sagas, Ivar was born with a condition that affected his bones or his ability to walk. Some sources suggest he had brittle bone disease, others that he was paralyzed below the waist, still others that he simply had unusually flexible bones or joints. The saga writers describe him as being carried into battle on a shield by his warriors, unable to walk but still commanding and fighting effectively. Whether this is historical fact or legendary embellishment is impossible to know with certainty. What we do know is that Ivar didn't let any physical limitations prevent him from becoming one of the most feared and respected Viking commanders of his age. If he truly couldn't walk, then his rise to power and his success in battle are all the more remarkable. he would have had to rely entirely on his intelligence, his strategic thinking, and his ability to inspire and command others. And in these areas, Ivar apparently excelled beyond any of his brothers. Ivar first enters the historical record as one of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army, the massive Viking force that invaded England in 865 to avenge the death of Ragnar Lothbrok. Along with his brothers Halfdan and Ubba, Ivar commanded an army that may have numbered in the thousands, the largest organized Viking force that had ever invaded England. But the Great Heathen Army was not just a typical Viking raiding party, hitting coastal targets and sailing away with plunder. Under Ivar's strategic direction, it was a genuine invasion force intent on conquest and permanent settlement. The army moved methodically across England, conquering kingdom after kingdom, establishing Danish rule over large swathes of English territory. The invasion began in East Anglia, where the Vikings forced the local king to provide them with horses and supplies. Then they moved north to Northumbria, where they captured the city of York in 866. When a Northumbrian army tried to retake the city, the Vikings defeated them decisively, killing both of Northumbria's rival kings and establishing their own rule over the kingdom. The Vikings then turned south, conquering Mercia and establishing a puppet king there. Then they conquered East Anglia, where King Edmund made the fatal mistake of trying to resist. According to legend, Ivar had Edmund executed by the Blood Eagle, the brutal Viking execution method, though this story may be later embellishment. What is certain is that Edmund died, and East Anglia came under Viking control. By 870, the Great Heathen Army had conquered 3 of the 4 major kingdoms of England. Only Wessex in the south remained independent, ruled by King Edil and his younger brother Alfred. The Vikings invaded Wessex in 870, and a series of battles followed. The fighting was fierce and the outcome unclear for several years. Ivar led the Viking forces with his usual strategic brilliance, but the men of Wessex fought desperately to defend their homeland. Then, around 870 or 871, Ivar disappears from the historical record. The sources differ on what happened to him. Some say he died in battle in England. Others claim he left England and went to rule in Dublin, where he became a powerful king. Still others say he died of illness. The Irish annals record the death of Imar, king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain in 873, and this may be Ivar the Boneless, though we cannot be certain. What we can be certain of is that Ivar's strategic vision shaped the course of English history. The Great Heathen Army's conquest created the Danelaw, the large portion of England that came under Scandinavian law and culture. This Danish presence in England would last for generations and would profoundly influence English language, law, and culture. Vikings settled in England, intermarried with the English, and became part of the fabric of English society. Ivar's genius lay not just in winning battles but in thinking strategically about long-term goals. While other Viking leaders were content to raid and plunder, Ivar understood that real power came from conquest and settlement. He built alliances, made strategic choices about which kingdoms to attack when, and established systems of rule that would last beyond his own lifetime. He was a nation builder, not just a warrior. The story of Ivar the Boneless offers powerful lessons, particularly for anyone who has faced physical limitations or disabilities. If the stories of his physical condition are true, then Ivar succeeded at the highest level of Viking warfare despite being unable to walk, despite having to be carried into battle. He didn't let his limitations define him or prevent him from achieving his goals. Instead, he developed his mental and strategic abilities to such a degree that his physical limitations became almost irrelevant. Ivar's story reminds us that physical strength and ability, while valuable, are not the only or even the most important qualities for success. Intelligence, strategic thinking, the ability to inspire others, the capacity for long-term planning, these qualities can be just as important or more important than physical prowess. Ivar proved that you don't need to be the strongest or the most physically capable to become a great leader. You need vision, intelligence, and determination. The story also reminds us that our limitations, whatever they may be, don't have to prevent us from achieving great things. We all have limitations of some kind. Some are physical, some are mental, some are circumstantial. But like Ivar, we can work around our limitations, can develop our strengths, can find ways to achieve our goals even when the path seems blocked. Ivar also demonstrates the importance of playing to your strengths. If he truly couldn't walk, then Ivar wisely didn't try to become the kind of warrior who wins through personal combat and physical prowess. Instead, he became the kind of leader who wins through strategy, planning, and the ability to command others effectively. He played to his strengths rather than lamenting his weaknesses. Finally, Ivar's story shows us that the greatest victories often come not from one brilliant moment but from sustained strategic thinking and long-term planning. The great heathen army's conquest of England took years and required careful planning, strategic choices about where and when to attack, the ability to maintain an army in the field for extended periods, and the vision to see beyond immediate plunder to long-term settlement. This is true in our own lives as well. The greatest achievements usually come not from sudden inspiration but from sustained effort, careful planning, and strategic thinking over time. As you lie here preparing for sleep, think about Ivar the Boneless, the strategic genius who overcame whatever limitations he had to become one of the most successful Viking commanders in history. You too have strengths that can compensate for your limitations, abilities that can carry you to success even when the path seems difficult. But tonight is not for planning campaigns or overcoming obstacles. Tonight is for rest, for allowing your strategic mind to quiet, for letting your body recover. Ivar's brilliant mind watches over you, protecting your rest even as it embodies the power of intelligence and strategic thinking. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your thoughts drift away like fog clearing from a battlefield. You have thought enough today, have planned enough, have strategized enough. Now it's time simply to rest, to allow sleep to claim you. Sleep peacefully under the protection of Ivar the Boneless, the master strategist who proved that the power of the mind can overcome the limitations of the body, that intelligence and determination can achieve what strength alone cannot. Rest now, brave listener, and may you wake tomorrow with some of Ivar's strategic brilliance, some of his ability to overcome obstacles, and all of his determination to succeed despite limitations. And so we come to the end of our journey through the lives of the Viking heroes, these remarkable men and women who lived over 1,000 years ago but whose stories still inspire us today. We have walked with Ragnar Lothbrok through his life of adventure and his death of courage. We have composed poetry with Egil Skallagrimsson, expressing grief and saving lives with words. We have stood with Freydis Eiríksdóttir as she faced down an army. We have traveled the world with Harald Hardrada and Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir. We have raided the Mediterranean with Bjorn Ironside and defended our independence with Lagertha. We have explored new worlds with Erik the Red and conquered kingdoms with Ivar the Boneless. Each of these heroes teaches us something different, but they all share certain qualities: courage in the face of danger, determination when obstacles seemed insurmountable, adaptability when circumstances changed, and the fierce determination to live life on their own terms, to create a reputation that would outlive their bodies, to make their mark on the world. But perhaps the most important thing these heroes teach us is that heroism comes in many forms. It's not just about fighting battles or conquering kingdoms. Gudrid's heroism was in her willingness to keep moving forward after repeated losses, to keep exploring even when safer options were available. Egil's heroism was partly in his battles but also in his poetry, in his willingness to express deep emotions and to save lives with words rather than swords. Erik the Red's heroism was in his adaptability, his ability to turn exile into opportunity. These Viking heroes were not perfect. Many of them did things we would today consider terrible. They raided peaceful settlements, killed innocent people, forced conversions, engaged in slavery. We can acknowledge these historical realities while still finding value and inspiration in their stories. People are complex, capable of both great and terrible things, and we can learn from both their virtues and their flaws. What we can take from these stories is not a desire to live exactly as the Vikings did. Our world is different, our challenges are different, our moral understanding is different and in many ways better. But we can be inspired by their courage, their determination, their willingness to face the unknown, their refusal to be defined by others' expectations, their capacity to overcome obstacles and limitations. You may never fight in a battle or explore unknown lands or rule a kingdom. But you face your own challenges, your own fears, your own obstacles. You have your own goals to pursue, your own limitations to overcome, your own path to walk. The Viking heroes stand as examples of what human courage and determination can achieve, of how we can face our challenges with dignity and strength. But now, the time for striving is past. The heroes have told their stories, and now it's time for you to rest. There will be time tomorrow for courage and determination, for facing challenges and pursuing goals. Tonight is for rest, for allowing your body and mind to recover and renew. Feel your body now, heavy and relaxed in your comfortable bed. Feel how your breathing has slowed, how your heartbeat is calm and steady. Feel how your mind has quieted, how the concerns of the day have faded into the background. This is the natural and necessary state of rest, the nightly journey into sleep that allows us to wake refreshed and ready for the next day's challenges. The Viking heroes we've met tonight stand guard around you now, a circle of protection made of courage and honor. Ragnar Lothbrok with his cleverness and his courage. Egil Skallagrimsson with his fierce emotions transformed into art. Freydis Eiríksdóttir with her defiant courage. Harald Hardrada with his vast experience and his fearless heart. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir with her resilience and adaptability. Olaf Tryggvason with his absolute conviction. Bjorn Ironside with his determination to forge his own legend. Lagertha with her fierce independence. Erik the Red with his ability to turn adversity into opportunity. Ivar the Boneless with his strategic brilliance. These heroes stand watch while you sleep, ensuring your safety, providing protection, allowing you to rest without fear or worry. You are safe in their keeping, safe in this moment, safe to surrender completely to sleep. Let your breathing be slow and deep, like the waves rolling onto a shore, rhythmic and eternal. In and out, each breath carrying you deeper into relaxation, closer to sleep. Your body knows how to do this. You don't need to try or to work at it. Simply allow it to happen naturally, the way water flows downhill, the way leaves fall from trees, the way night follows day. Your mind is quieting, thoughts becoming less distinct, less urgent. When a thought arises, you notice it gently and let it drift away like a cloud moving across the sky. You don't need to follow the thought or engage with it. Simply observe it and let it go. Your thoughts are not you. They are just mental events, passing phenomena, and they have no power over you right now. This moment is perfect just as it is. You don't need to be anywhere else or doing anything else. You don't need to worry about tomorrow or regret yesterday. All that exists is this present moment, this breath, this feeling of comfort and relaxation, this gentle drift toward sleep. Imagine yourself now in that ancient longhouse, the one we visited at the beginning of our journey. The fire has burned down to embers, giving off warmth but little light. Around you, everyone else is already sleeping, their breathing slow and rhythmic, creating a gentle chorus of peace. You are the last one awake, but not for much longer. The stories have been told. The day's work is done. The door is barred against the night. You are safe, warm, comfortable, and cared for. There is nothing left to do but sleep. And sleep is waiting for you, welcoming you, ready to embrace you. Feel yourself sinking now, sinking like a stone gently dropped into still water, drifting down through layers of consciousness, down through wakefulness into sleep. Down and down, deeper and deeper, comfortable and safe and completely at peace. The heroes are still standing guard, but you're barely aware of them now. Everything is becoming distant, dreamlike, less substantial. The line between waking and sleeping is blurring, and you're crossing over now, crossing into the realm of sleep, into the peaceful darkness where your body and mind can rest and renew. You are sleeping now. You are safe. You are at peace. The Viking heroes watch over you through the night, their courage providing protection, their stories having carried you to this place of rest. Sleep deeply. Sleep peacefully. Sleep completely. And when you wake, may you carry with you some of the courage, determination, and honor of the Viking heroes whose stories you've heard tonight. May your dreams be gentle. May your rest be complete. May you wake refreshed and renewed, ready to face your own challenges with the courage of the Vikings who came before. Sleep now. Simply sleep. The stories are told. The night is here. And you are safe in the keeping of heroes. Sleep.